Welcome back, everybody. We are so excited to be talking about yet another fantastic film with fantastic stories to tell. My name is Devorah Governale.
And I'm Carrie Parker.
Yay! And today we are bridging the gap as we wrap up Black History Month and Black Stories Always. And we rev into March, which is our Women's Month. And my heavens, are there just so many wonderful women's stories to tell. So the one that we are going to focus on today is Hidden Figures. I actually cannot believe that we are in the 10th year, the 10th anniversary of that film. Where did the last decade go? I don't even know. I feel like I just watched this in theaters and was just crying and loving it so much, and so grateful to hear and finally become aware of the stories of these three incredible women that were represented in the story. And so, yeah, we're going to dive into their story. So I'm going to just kick us off by chatting a little bit about the film version and kind of comparing it to the actual history, actual timeline. So like I said, the film came out 10 years ago, and then the film itself starts 100 years ago. Our first scene takes place in 1926, and we are seeing a very young Katherine Johnson, and we are introduced to the massive genius that she has going on and the wonderful parents that she had that made sure she had an education that would really foster the development of these insanely incredible skills that she had that went on to truly shape American history. So she did go on after school to work for NASA. She worked for NASA for 33 years. She retired in 1986. And side personal fact, we moved to Langley, Richmond, Virginia area right around then, right around 85, 86. And my dad worked for NASA. So he has passed on, and he might not even remember. So I don't know that I would ever be able to find out. But there is a very small chance that my dad and Katherine Johnson worked at the same NASA location, even if it was just for a little blip of time, which is kind of crazy to me. Like how, what?
That's
like
so
I was starstruck when I was doing the math in my head. I was like, wait a second. I think my dad worked there at the same time as her, like right at the very end. But oh my gosh. So just, if that is true, I would be so honored at the idea that my dad worked even for a day, overlapping, starting about the same time that she retired from NASA. This story also focuses on Dorothy Vaughan, who was the first Black supervisor at NASA, as well as Mary Jackson, who was the first Black engineer at NASA. So there is a lot that this film gets right. A little of it is a little skewed. The story in real life itself really takes place over 30 years, about 3 decades. But, you know, storytelling, film is a storytelling medium. We need to keep that pacing. We need to keep that engagement. And so it really shrinks all the events down to 2 years, right around 1961 and 1962. So we've got a little bit of kind of straddling those years. It was actually 1953 that Katherine Johnson was on the Flight Research Division and then was moved to that Space Task Group. So it was almost 10 years prior to what we see in the film. Dorothy Vaughan did become a supervisor and really push for that, but it was almost a decade and a half sooner. It was 1949. She was one of the very first people at NASA to figure out that IBM computer, got it in there just a little smidge before it happens in the movie. And it was a very challenging task to undertake. I think those of us from Gen X and Zennials might remember that computers at that time literally filled an entire room. I mean, they took up like massive size room, not a little room, like a giant room. And even then, it still had nothing in comparison to like memory and power to just your cell phone. Your cell phone today still is far more powerful, but that was a major milestone, major stepping stone in the advancement of computers. My dad, again, having worked for NASA right around the same time as these women right at the end of their career, he actually had 4 computers in our house back in the early 90s, which most people didn't even have one PC. Definitely feel like I got to have a lot of experience with watching the advancement of computers. And then Mary Jackson, like I said, she did become the first Black engineer, but it was actually 1958. So it was about 5 years sooner than what's portrayed in the film. You have a few events that are just slightly different from what you see in the film. The whole issue that Katherine has with not being able to get to the restroom efficiently that actually happened to Mary. It wasn't Katherine that happened to. So she was the one that had to travel quite a distance to be able to get to the restroom. Katherine technically did have the issue that the colored restroom was on the other side of campus, but she just went to the white restroom. She just went. And there was one time that someone did complain about it, and she basically just kind of ignored it and was like, whatever, I got to do my job. So that includes needing to use the restroom, and I don't have time to walk across campus. So, of course, we have a very dramatized version of it. There has been a little scrutiny. Kevin Costner scene ripping down the sign, which is a very Hollywood version and very heartfelt. But there, of course, is the perspective of that being more white savior perception versus her just standing up for herself and just using the restroom that she's going to choose to use. So there's feelings. There's feelings out there. The director has spoken about that and how he wanted to show that white people need to make good choices. Black people need to make good choices. That was kind of his response to that. But also then there was kind of the counter response of, yeah, but Black stories need to be heard and they need to be told. So there's feelings.
Yes, 100%. It's so hard, again, when you are zooming out that timeline like we talked about, the idea of how do you symbolize the allies that were there, that were consistently trying to support, who were consistently trying to flow against the stream of society and culture at the time, who were, of course, trying to maintain the systemic oppression system. And it is hard to symbolize that in film sometimes. I definitely therefore get that plight. But also that visual symbolism of him tearing that sign down, I understand as an artistic choice of trying to make that statement of there had to be people in power who were willing to role model, who were willing to engage, who were willing to advocate as well, because otherwise that is part of the systemic oppression concept, is that the system doesn't allow those who are being oppressed to advocate fully for themselves, and it invalidates when they do. So it is a very fine line to walk. It's a very difficult thing, but I do therefore get it. And so yes, as a director, I feel like I would probably have that same dilemma of how can we create a symbolic representation of this without, unfortunately, tripping over the white savior concept. It's really hard, but I do hope that genuinely what it represented is the idea that Catherine was respected. There were people who were willing to fight for her, who were willing to make space for her in rooms, who did not want to enable the system, but unfortunately knew we're not going to change the system overnight. And as you said, it was really a few decades that took place. And so it's really hard to like bite-size that kind of battle against systemic oppression into a concise little scene. So yeah.
It's true. And we have the scene with her and Jim Parsons' character and Kevin Costner's character where she's like, I have to be in the meeting. I have to be there. Everything is happening and changing and updating so rapidly. I have to be in there. So that really did happen in her life where she had to push and say, look, I'm female, I'm African American, and you have a problem with that. But it doesn't change the fact I have to be there if we're going to accomplish what we all have as a shared goal. And yeah. Katherine Johnson herself has gone on to say she didn't really feel that. She just kept doing what she needed to do. And it did reach the point where she kind of earned that status where she did reach a point where she was really never questioned anymore. And she was relied on. Like I just said, the IBM computers, they were new and they were fast. And there was a lot of positives that came with the computer. There were challenges too, but a lot of positives. But still, she said it kept making mistakes. And she was always the person they went to. She said, I was always checking the computer's computations. Like she spent a lot of her career checking that math and making sure it was right. And it wasn't always right. And they had to lean on her. So again, that just tells you how incredible she was, as a female, as a mind, as everything that she was was smarter than these brand new computers. And to clarify computer, because we hear the phrase computer and you see it as a noun for a human as well as a noun for the computer itself. And I know generationally now we've just used that noun for like an inanimate object, the computer. But at the time, like we were just talking about, computers were brand new. Hardly anyone used them. They barely existed. There were no PCs. and they took up an entire room. So you had people who literally did computations. They computed for a living. And so just like I design and make costumes and I refer to myself as a costumer, they did computations and they refer to themselves as computers. And that was really why computers were called what they were, because humans were called that for so long before computers came along. So computers actually got their name from the human version of it. Like you said, a lot of what happens in here kind of became almost like a symbolism or an imagery just to kind of get the point across of what life really was for so many people at that time. We're right in the heart of civil rights. These men and women and children were dealing with the Jim Crow laws. Mary Jackson, we get another example of that. We get kind of a heightened version of I need to go to school so I can become this engineer I want to become. She, in the film, goes to court and has a beautiful scene with the judge. But in real life, she just went to the city. But what we see portrayed in the film is representation of what many, many, many people had to endure. Kevin Costner, Jim Parsons, and Kirsten Dunst, actually, their characters themselves are kind of the epitome of that as well. We're talking about a time when there was it literally took a village to get the first American into space and the first American on the moon. It took a village. So there was really about 300 different workers at that time. So of course, you're going to talk about a more complex org chart and management scale. So Kevin Costner at first almost didn't sign on because it was taking kind of 3 different supervisors of that task force and melding it into one human, because it just wouldn't have been as easy of storytelling film-wise to show all of these individuals. So they kind of boiled him down into one. Same with Kirsten Dunst. She doesn't play an actual historical figure, but again, she's just kind of representing what these women had to endure in the workforce. And then same with Jim Parsons. His character is fictional, but represented a lot of what had to be endured and what was going on. As a costume designer, he just spot on 1961, that clean cut, the narrow tie, the short sleeve white button up. He just fits that character to a T. So he did a fantastic job. John Glenn, oh my goodness, the actresses could not sing his praise enough. He really was there advocating for these women and making sure that their voices were heard. As the guy who was going to go into space and whose life was literally on the line, he recognized that their skill set was literally capable of saving his life. And he really advocated for that. He had, the biggest thing on the line you could have. So he did, in fact, the climactic portion of, as we're getting to the end of the film, he did, in fact, say, I will only get on the ship if she checks the math on this. And it does get a little dramatized. We get Pharrell and his fantastic running song. And
oh my gosh,
thousands of people on the beach waiting, hoping he's going to make it onto this mission. She's rushing. And, Mary looks at her and is like, why are you taking a break? And she's rushing back. In real life, she actually had about a week. So she did have plenty of time to check that math, but it was much more fun, of course, the way we see it in the film, the way that's portrayed. But John Glenn was very much an advocate of their work. I really loved to hear, as the film was first coming out and being promoted by the leading ladies, they just could not speak more praise. They were so honored to be able to portray the life of these 3 women from history. Another kind of film, Hollywood magic they do. These women did work there and their work did overlap. They were not quite as close and not quite as tight in real life. But again, it just makes for a little bit more positive and dramatic storytelling effect to have all 3 of them there at the same time. They were a little more spread out. They didn't interact quite as much, but the 3 performers who portrayed them were so honored to be able to tell these stories and get them out to the world in a format that more people could see and understand them. And they said, this movie, it really is a film about unity. It's a film about understanding that we have to put our differences aside if we are ever going to be successful in driving humanity forward. There was going to be no way for us as Americans, as mankind, to put a person into space. When you really think about what that takes, it's astronomical, literally, what it takes to put a man in space. And they said to be able to tell a story where it is showcasing that we have to put those differences aside, or we'll never make change. We'll never make progression. We'll never accomplish what we can accomplish together if we're always focused on our differences. So I appreciate that. This film, of course, is based on a book by Margot Lee Shetterly. She actually was the daughter of a gentleman who worked for NASA, and they were just kind of going through some old photos, and they came across a photo of these women who all worked for NASA. You had women working for NASA as early as 1943. The World War II was still going on while they're starting to make these trailblazing motions in NASA. And as she asked her father who those were, and he explained who they were, she just couldn't believe she had never heard of them before. So she wrote this book. It actually came out September of 2016, and the film came out December. So they were clearly kind of being produced simultaneously, that this information was coming out. But yeah, you had NASA. It was actually NACA at first, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, and it became NASA in 1958. And that's one other timeline difference that's just a little different. That was the actual year that they abolished segregation. So about 3 years before this movie takes place, they had already kind of done away with what we see portrayed in 61 and 62. But it was important to be able to get all of that condensed to those years because it was the height of the civil rights movement. It was when John Glenn was going into space. A lot of real footage with, President Kennedy and, other citizens that were so engaged in watching this race to space and race to the moon. So this is one of those things where in film, you can just kind of forgive, or the suspension of disbelief, as we see a lot in live theater, because that really helps the storytelling experience to be a little more intense and a little more succinct, and you're able to get a little more out of it. So the team that was producing this film, they all kind of decided together that it was okay to have these little shifts off from how things really unfolded, because then you got more of the story accurately portrayed in a shorter amount of time. So yes, so grateful this film exists in the world. So grateful we get to know about these women who were trailblazers, did so much for us as women, so much for us as Americans. Katherine Johnson did go on, I want to say it was 2015. She did get the Medal of Freedom from President Obama. It was so heartwarming to watch that ceremony as she received that acknowledgement, a kiss on the cheek from Obama. And, she always talked about it like it wasn't that big of a deal. She was just doing math, which she loved, and she was just doing work that she knew was important, and she just quietly pushed forward, and she didn't complain. She was more about presenting solutions than she was about complaining about what was going on. And just incredible women, and so grateful we get to be inspired from them forever, really, through film. So yeah. All right, over to you, Miss Carrie.
I do love that the space race used as a setting, and that idea of segregation and our perceptions and societal politics, that unfortunately every single society ends up having some form of systemic oppression or prejudice built into it. And we as Americans, ours is obviously built into the foundation, which was slavery, unfortunately, in the slave trade. But the fact that, therefore, Black history, that reality of, I still want to validate, we have such a melting pot at this point, but also acknowledging people's ancestry and lineage, and how we did become the melting pot we are. But again, at those times, so the reality that it took the race to space and what a big mission that was, and the prioritization of, we need to get a man alive around the planet, right? They didn't have the space to say only white people can do this, because the evidence was only white people weren't cutting it. It wasn't working that way. And that's, like you said about Jim Parsons' struggle with taking the role, it's a big struggle, because essentially he is portraying what would have been a very normal person at the time. The idea that he was a white man who probably perceives he worked really, really hard to get there. And then he was told his only main competition were going to be men. and at the time, white men. The idea that they create that background, because I'm sure at the time there was also Black men making their way into those career fields as well. But they kept the stark contrast to show the double-edged battle sword of unfortunately being a woman and being Black in these fields. And I therefore do love that they set us up in the beginning of showing her as a child, and that her family supported her, that her family took the skills and abilities that she was blessed with, and they didn't see it as problematic. They did not try to discourage her. They encouraged her, and they actually set her up for success so that she could move on. They saw it as a blessing. They saw it as a skill. They saw it as a God-given talent, and that it should be something that she gets to fulfill. And that's also half the battle. Accepting and acknowledging that our families and where we're born to, the setting and time, all of those things create a multicultural identity, right? We talk about it in biopsychosocial concepts as well in mental health, but multicultural identity is who we are, and it's where you're born to, the generation you're born to, the time period you're born to, all of these things that create you as an individual and your path that you are on. So the reality that this story specifically and these ladies against our space background, and we're so lucky that they did prioritize the life and safety of these gentlemen enough to be willing to accept people that they would not typically have allowed to have these statuses, right? Like the whole scene and situation about her being in the meeting room, because I love that Jim Parsons kind of identified there are no women in the briefing room. Like, so she's knocking down two things at the same time with her God-given talent and skill, and how important that is, therefore, for two different realms and two populations, two multicultural groups, that crossing those boundaries and those gates, as gatekeeping as we call it, so substantial. So I love that we looked at it that way. And Kevin Costner, so interesting, right? Because we grew up watching Kevin Costner through the years. I remember thinking, my mommy loves Kevin Costner. You know what I'm saying? Like, I remember these things, and but walking that line in that role, like you said, it was like three people combined into one, but it also means he's alone in that role and representing this concept. And the idea of how we see certain actors and perceive certain actors, and Kevin Costner has managed to be one of those gentlemen throughout our time. I mean, he was in The Bodyguard with Whitney Houston. You know what I mean? He has like endeared himself to us, that we as women feel pretty safe with him, right? He speaks with such authority and confidence. He believes what he says, period. And that's what gives us that sensation of, okay, I'm here. I'm willing to follow that guy. So that's such a powerful statement. I appreciate, because as casting directors, you got to think about those things. Because if you pick someone who has the wrong air about them, all these stories fall flat, right? And then that's also on the director to make sure that this cast as a group are going to work together, and this is the story we're telling. That reality that Jim Parsons had probably an existential struggle is that he had to step back and be like, but this isn't about me. So having those conversations as a cast, right? And the idea of, I feel really gross about this, but also acknowledging it's okay to feel gross about it. Villains exist.
Gross about it. I remember talking about that. We were in Virginia telling a story that was, like 100, almost 150 years before this, about another biopic about a young man born in slavery. And I said the same thing to him. You're seeing all these scenes that you're standing behind the camera every time they say action, and you just feel so gross, but you know that it really happened. And I said to the director, I was like, to be honest with you, I am so grateful that I feel gross when I watch this. Wouldn't it be worse if I just looked at this scene and said, yep, that's right, or yeah, that's the way it's supposed to be? Like, wouldn't that be so much worse? Isn't it a sign of progress to feel gross by that? And that doesn't mean we're not done. We still have a journey, but thank heavens we feel gross and angry and frustrated when we see characters do things. Hopefully it means we're at least moving, maybe a little too slow still, but we're moving.
Baby girl, I love you so much, but this is why I love you, because that reality is you have empathy.
Mm-hmm.
I hate crying so much.
Well, because you watch what these humans, these citizens went through. They weren't even considered citizens for so long, actually. And it makes you feel so angry to know that people were mistreated in this way. And I don't know if that's just because I was raised by a mama and an auntie that preached that my whole childhood, because they also lived in Florida. I know this takes place in Virginia, and then we see a little bit in Cape Canaveral, which my mom was, I don't know, 5 or 6, living really close to that location at the time of some of these scenes right at the very end. She was right there. So my dad's right there at the end of her life. My mom was right there kind of in the prime of her life. And they were heartbroken to see it. They were heartbroken to see the way that people were treated. My grandmother was so great about just having a very open home and having anyone in the neighborhood over. And my grandmother experienced vandalism from that. Her car got vandalized because she had such an open home. But my grandmother also fought Nazis. So she knew what it was to be part of a marginalized group of people. She wasn't even Jewish, but she was fighting Nazis. And so, yeah, I think it's one of the reasons why these stories touch my heart so big, because I was raised by strong women who lived through mistreatment as well. And they wanted to raise daughters who would go on to help make the world a better place. I won't claim that I've done that, but I certainly have tried to live up to what they want. And I appreciate this medium of film, because that can do the same thing of inspiring us. Healing can't really start until a story is told, and you can't make things better until you know it needs to be better. So, these stories being told are so important for that healing and for empowering us to take action and make things better. And that's why we have these conversations, because film has the power to do that for us and for our world.
This is why we joke about how this is our therapy, but the reality is that is exactly why. Narrative is so important. The narratives that we tell about ourselves, the narratives we tell about our existence. And this is also why I adore you so much. Unfortunately, in my mental health career field, I've watched people tell false narratives. I have watched people lie. I've watched, which is completely different from delusion, right? It's different from reality perception, but that concept of you and I have empathy, but also what you said, that knowing that your grandma fought Nazis, but that your grandma was so focused on being a safe place. And that is often half the struggle. The idea that we, just in our own lifetime, have had to sit here and feel like, well, duh. But no offense to people who might not feel the same as we do, but I shouldn't have to wear something that signifies I'm a safe space for LGBTQ, that I'm a safe space for people who aren't white right now. Like, I shouldn't have to put out those flags and markers, but I'll be more than happy to. But that idea of we don't look at multicultural identity as disgusting. We look at multicultural identity as, I bet you have such a story, right? I bet you have such a flavorful story. I bet you have so many different experiences than me. I want to hear about those experiences, for better or worse. We look at it as global citizens. We look at it in the reality of, I might live in this bubble, this sphere of existence, but that's not the only one out there. And I'm willing to perceive that it might not even be the best version out there, and that the best version is going to be from the most collaborative and empathetic and willing to look at what's best for everyone, not just me. And that's the reality of why we feel so gross that this is not as naturally just existing across the board. But unfortunately, in the mental health world, I've learned why, to an extent, in different ways, it doesn't exist. And unfortunately, it is fear. It's a whole nother that's a whole nother story. It might be why I got a tattoo though. So, but that idea, oh my gosh, the kitty knew.
It's like calling out.
Yes, the kitty knew we were crying. I do love, as much as they might have had to fudge the accuracy with history, that they did it, and that the actors were willing to accept these representations as concise and boiled down reductions of the actual experience and timeline as they might have been. But because it is important, and also having that tangible experience with the characters, which our ladies got to do, the fact that these ladies are aware, right? But also willing to have those conversations, willing to engage in these projects, these stories being told, and acknowledge that there are going to be dynamics in the story being told. The people who end up choosing the fight are the ones who they can't suppress their talents, abilities. They can't just try to find the path of least resistance in that situation and fight what's safe to fight. They're like, no, I can't. I literally cannot do that. And luckily, these ladies had that courage, and they made it to paving those paths and opening those doors, breaking those boundaries so that people could follow, because that's the hardest part of the battle. Having to accept their women's abilities and what settings and situations it's going to put them in, because that's a big task, right? And understanding your partner and their skills and abilities, which might be completely different from your own, also a middle path to walk. So they both did great jobs coming to terms with it. He did a great job coming back around and apologizing for his initial reaction to her job and her abilities. So we adore that. We appreciate the role modeling and representation also put into the story, right? Of people having to accept, you're right, I was wrong. I did not respond properly to that. Great story. I'm glad we got to do it. So much more to talk about, but that's another time and another place.
I mean, it's just a beautiful story. I feel like in a lot of the interviews that I saw, you had just so many people do how did I never hear about these women before? How did I never hear this story before? So I do love it for wrapping up Black History Month and kicking off Women's History Month, Her Story Month, because it is all about making sure these stories are getting out there and we are sharing. Because again, it's how we heal. It's how we are motivated to do better. It's how we are inspired to help make the world a better place. So yeah. Like you said, we could talk about this story for hours. It is just beautiful and powerful and amazing. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for yet another fantastic episode about the fun and amazing and wonderful films that we've got out here in the world. We definitely want to hear your thoughts and what you have thought about Hidden Figures and the film itself, as well as the story of the real life humans that were in it. We really know that these stories have the power to do so much in our world. So we'd love to hear all of that from you. So thank you for joining us yet again.
Yes, thank you guys so much. We are headed into Women's History. It accomplished 2 things for us. If you have any ideas, suggestions, ones that you want us to watch, that you're like, this is a great one, send it our direction, because as much as this is about us talking about stories that have impacted and influenced us, totally here to have the sharing, right? Because that's just like music. It's a love language. Sharing music is a love language. Sharing movies, sharing any kind of story expression and art is a love language. So feel free to throw stuff at us, and we're more than happy to take a look and do an episode.
Yeah, absolutely. Yay. Well, we'll be excited to see you guys next time. In the meantime, go watch lots of movies, and we can't wait to talk about more of them with you. Thank you so much. Bye.